So, um, so let's begin by reading chapter. Actually, we'll just read the laborers in the vineyard in chapter 20. It's chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. For the kingdom of heaven is like a householder who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And going out about the third hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And to them he said, "You go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right, I will give you." So they went. Going out again about the sixth hour and the ninth hour, he did the same. And about the 11th hour, he went out and found them standing and said to them, "Why do you stand idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You go into the vineyard too." And when the evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his steward, "Call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first." And when those hired about the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius. Now, when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. And on it, they grumbled at the householders, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day in the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give this to the last, as I gave to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity?" So the last will be first, and the first last. So a while ago, when we were talking about the parables, we mentioned that the parables tend to have um, one or more gut-wrenching things in them. So what are the gut-wrenching things, the things that are most striking that would strike its listeners as being awry here?
Complaining when they were paid what they were promised.
Right? That's one. What else?
The person who came on the 11th hour earned the same as the person who worked all day.
Right. And then there's at least one more, which is very easy to miss. Does anyone have a sense of what it might be? So,
Do you begrudge generosity?
Yeah, that comes in with the complaining. The so the so this is obviously he's hiring a lot of laborers. So by implication, this is a large estate, right? The large estates are run by stewards,
Oh, no.
and the landowner are absent. So ordinarily, it would be a steward who goes out and handles the hiring. Um, it's also so here the landowner is present. So that's, so in some sense, a very shocking thing. And then Actually, come to think of it, a second really shocking thing is that the landowner hires, uh, people throughout the day.
Mhm.
If you've ever seen, migrant laborers congregating, in the morning to be hired, day laborers, um, once, the hirers come and hire, and to wait for maybe the next kind of hiring shift if there's going to be one, but then they disperse having not received work for the day. So here we have people who at the end of the day are still waiting.
Mm.
So so those are, I think, the four most um, discordant features of the parable, the things that are really striking, that kind of make you ask what's going on here and why are they doing this. So, so the parable is unique to Matthew. It doesn't appear in the other synoptics. And so how does it relate to 19 or the previous block of text? Does anyone have any ideas?
Well, he's showing that as a person who has always been first, you can't expect the same treatment in heaven. That it's not based on who you, what your status was on earth. It's based on what it is that Jesus values.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And they're working on, their status as we worked all day. So we have
Right.
higher status than those who only worked an hour.
So it kind of illustrates the last shall be first and the first last, although it doesn't do it exactly literally. It's that in some sense they're all end up being equal. Um, so we'll talk about that more. Um, the text begins with the four for the of heaven. So the four is a logical connector that is intended to connect the the parable to the end of chapter 19. So that's one of the connections that illustrates the theme of eschatological reversal, that the first are last and the last are first. But then it also attempts to answer, what then will we have? Right, in chapter 19, verse 27, where Peter says, behold, we have left everything in you. What then shall we have?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is Jesus' attempt to answer the question, what then shall we have? He's already said that the rewards are eternal ones and are not necessarily going to be expected in this life. And now he's presenting the parable to indicate what the rewards are, which I guess you could say makes everything a whole lot worse.
Being a disciple does not get you ahead of the others.
Right. Yeah. So clearly a
All
more,
enjoy heaven.
uh-huh. So clearly should not take pride in his or her status.
No.
So there's one parallel to the parable. Let's take a look at it. It's in 1 Samuel chapter 30. 21 through 25.
First Samuel chapter 30, you said?
Uh-huh. 30. Verse 21. Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow David and who had been left at the brook Besor. And they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. And when David drew near to the people, he saluted them. Then all the wicked and base fellows among the men who had gone with David said, because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil which we have recovered, except that each man may lead away his wife and children and depart. God said, you shall not do so, my brothers, with what the Lord has given us. He has preserved us and given into our hand the band that came against us. Who would listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes down into the battle, so shall his share be who stays by the baggage. They shall share alike. And from that day forward, he made it a statute and an ordinance for Israel to this day. So both those who engaged in battle and those who are left behind received the same share of the spoil. And those who resisted or didn't like it, who believed that they should get everything, and those who stayed behind should get nothing except that they're allowed to, basically to escape with their lives and the lives of their family, that they're described as wicked and evil. In some ways, that sort of is a parallel to this parable. So clearly, this is clearly a very allegorical parable. Um, so, what is?
So now we're back to Matthew, right?
Uh-huh.
Kingdom of heaven. It's the kingdom of heaven.
It's the kingdom of heaven. The vineyard is a sort of a traditional symbol of Israel, and it has eschatological overtones. Let's take a look. I think at Isaiah chapter 65.
Isaiah 65.
Actually start at verse 17. Which should sound very familiar. For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former things shall not be remembered or come into mind. Remember chapter 20 of Revelation, 21 of Revelation. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth coming down. Then I saw a new Jerusalem coming down from heaven. But be glad and rejoice forever in that which I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem a rejoicing, and her people a joy. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and be glad in my people. No more shall be heard in it the sound of weeping and the cry of distress. No more shall there be in it an infant that lives but a few days, or an old man who does not fill out his days. For the child shall die 100 years old, and the sinner 100 years old shall be accursed. They shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. So vineyards are part of the new heaven and the new earth that God creates. Vineyards are also an arena in which bad shepherds are very active. So Jeremiah talks about many shepherds have destroyed my vineyard. And then in Deuteronomy, both in Deuteronomy and Joshua, vineyards are described as a gift of the promised land. And then finally, also remember that Jesus is the true vine in God's vineyard. Let's take a look at that as well. It's John 15, verses 1 through 8. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. So he's the vineyard owner. Every branch of mine that bears no fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes that it may bear more fruit. You are already made clean by the word which I have spoken to you. Abide in me and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. If a man does not abide in me, he is cast forth as a branch and withers, and the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you will, and it shall be done for you. So the vine, the vineyard is clearly eschatological, and ordinarily it's a traditional symbol of Israel, and it becomes a symbol of God's promises to the people of God and to the a testimony to the kingdom of God. So that's the vineyard. What about the laborers? What can we say about them?
They're representative of the people who at some point might enter into heaven, depending on the work they've done and as disciples of Christ.
Mm-hmm. Oh, also more for the hiring. So it's harvest time, or actually it's either planting or harvest time
Mm-hmm.
because of the need for day laborers. Day laborers aren't customarily, there's not a lot of work in the vineyard while the grapes are simply growing. There's a need for extra labor at planting and at harvest. So it's probably harvest time at the vineyard, which sort of reflects the eschatological element of the of the parable. Remember in chapter 13, Matthew or Jesus talks about harvesting in the vineyard. So, these are day laborers who are being hired. The usual wage paid to a worker for 1 day's labor is about a denarius, which basically allows them to feed family for that day. If they're paid less, it's probably not going to be of great value to work because you still don't earn enough to eat. So workers who have been forced off their land, in terms of who are day laborers at this point in Palestinian history, they're people who either don't have land and are forced to hire themselves out, or if they have land that they can farm, are making too little and have to augment their income. So one of the other striking things about this parable is that they're 12-hour day roughly, right? So at the 11th hour, workers are still standing waiting to be hired, which in general workers wouldn't do because they would have given up hope of being hired. So what does it say that the workers are there?
They still have hope of earning some money for the day and working.
Mm-hmm. Or
they have hope of salvation if we take it to the next level.
Or if less than hope, they're desperate.
Yeah.
Right? So clearly they're hanging around probably in the vain hope that they'll be hired and at least get something because they have to feed their families. Right? So their situation is desperate. Even the people hired in the very beginning are in desperate straits. The people who are not hired at all are really in desperate straits. So these are people who are really desperate. So it's kind of important, as sort of a backdrop to um, context for this whole thing, that it's not, sort of simply that, there are workers being hired, and isn't that nice? That these are people who are really desperate, and the desperation grows as you don't get hired, earlier. And so the people are still at basically at 5 o'clock, the 11th hour, are still standing around in the hope of getting hired, although in all probability there is no hope. So they are very desperate. So it says that all get their denarius.
It shows that the landowner recognizes their desperation. They're
Mm-hmm.
willing to hang around that long. They really need it.
Right, right. The landowner clearly recognizes the need. Let's take a look at earlier from the Sermon on the Mount at Matthew chapter 6. Well, I thought maybe I was sort of wondering whether I should mention it, and I think I will. There's a really brilliant book, which is mostly wrong, called Parables of Subversive Speech by an author named, what is his name? William Herzog, I think. Yeah, William Herzog. So he's an Anglican biblical scholar who was very influenced by the liberation theology movement in Catholicism. And so his book reflects, sort of a liberation theology perspective on Jesus' parables. So he argues, so the problem with it is that he really argues that the parables have been reflect original teachings of Jesus, but they've been taken out of their context, and sort of given an allegorical and given kind of a spiritual and religious interpretation, when what Jesus was actually trying to confront was the nature of oppression in Palestinian society.
Mm.
So he argues that that the landowner is basically, so the striking thing about the parable is that the landowner is present, which usually doesn't happen. So that's certainly true. But he sees the landowner as sort of an arrogant, overbearing, exploitative figure who is basically offering the minimum wage, but because there's no promise for tomorrow, even for those hired at the last hour, it raises the issue of what's going to be coming tomorrow, right? And then is addressing the one grumbling worker as friend is, sort of arrogant and condescending. So in some ways, it's a really great analysis, except that it's flawed because it assumes that there's this original layer that comes from Jesus, and that the gospel writers, well, in this case, Matthew, for all of the other parables, some kind of combination of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have taken them out of their original context, applied them here, whereas that's probably not true. But it does focus attention on, first of all, the landowner, right? That he offering only basically the minimum wage to everybody, and um, and the fact that he's present. So with that in mind, let's look at chapter 6 of Matthew. It's verse 25. I think we read it last week, in fact. Therefore, I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you shall eat or what you shall drink, put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? And which of you, by being anxious, can add 1 cubit to the span of life? And why are you anxious about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is alive and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? Therefore do not be anxious, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For the Gentiles seek all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them all. But first seek his righteousness, and all these things shall be yours as well. Therefore, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Let the day's own be sufficient for the day. So that message, I think, is very much reflected in the parable. There, a day's wage, it leaves in abeyance the question of tomorrow. But tomorrow, God will still be. So any thoughts about this?
It's very hard to live by.
Yeah, very hard to live by.
Really have
So,
to, it really tests your faith.
right, it really tests your faith. So, in terms of prosperity theology, one of the things that, it doesn't promise is untold riches, right? We don't get an airplane, a bigger airplane. We don't get to sell our existing airplane to buy a bigger airplane because we want to, we don't want our ministry to be static, whatever that means with an airplane. So there's a denarius a day offered, and that's basically subsistence wage. but everybody survives, including those who are hired at the last hour. They're desperate, and God provides for them. So, although we might like the riches, it's a powerful statement about God's provision and about God's compassion and about God, sort of being with those who are desperate. So, questions or thoughts or
Well, I think about what's going on today with the long food lines and the people getting the minimal help that they need. In many cases, very minimal.
oh, say more?
Well, they don't know where their next paycheck is coming. No money. They have enough for today,
Right.
and they're given enough for a week, maybe
Uh-huh.
a bare minimum.
Right. Right. Yeah. So at this point, huge numbers of people are in extreme need or
Mm-hmm.
facing extreme need.
And I suspect more will be out of work shortly because the federal government has given money to businesses to keep them hired for a few months. But that's about to come to an end if it hasn't already for some.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So
Right.
it's a
And
very,
also
very uncertain time.
right. We also don't know what the effect of the pandemic going forward is going to be,
Mhm.
or the impact on the economy going forward is going to be. The the layoffs or the idleness has been a factor, a reflection of the fact businesses have shut down. But going forward, uh, unemployment may be a result of the fact that uh, people are being laid off because there are no sales. There are businesses are open, but they're well. In some cases, they may well go out of business, and in others, um, there are going to be layoffs because the economy just hasn't come back.
I got an email just yesterday from a business that I support, and there are about 12 people who work there, and they're all. She said, I can no longer support living, working, having a storefront in this location. We're going to have to go to all online orders. And it was for a knitting shop. And if you had classes scheduled, you know, there'll have to be other arrangements made with the instructors because there won't be a space to take the class.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking all those women, and some of them are single, they're the only wage earner in the family. They live on their own. That was their job.
Right.
And then the Alleluia bookstore, I went to,
Right.
patronize it, and it was gone. And I'm thinking, I wonder
Mm-hmm.
where they are, if they have anything else going on.
Yeah. Yeah. Really a shame. Yeah. Very much a shame.
So that's about 12 households that are affected now, at least.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. A very, very difficult time.
Mhm.
And a time to really turn to God and look to God for God's provision.
Mhm. Because what they will get for unemployment will probably be very minimal, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, unemployment is minimal. I mean,
It is, but I mean, very
it's
minimal in this case.
yeah, yeah. So one of the things that the parable challenges, so we all have, I think, and especially in our society, a view that we, if we work hard, we will earn good stuff, right? And the harder you work, the more you earn. And it's through your merits, that you become successful. So that's, sort of one side of the coin. But then you see the other side of the coin in this parable that the others have not worked as much, so they don't deserve the same pay. So implicitly, the view that you have worked harder and therefore deserve more amounts to a demonization of those who have not. Right? So
Mhm.
problem. So I'm earning what I deserve, and those lazy people, those abject failures, need to get up and get to work, and they would be as successful as me, but they're not because they're lazy.
It probably started with a different set of circumstances. I've been reading a book on racism and anti-racism,
Uh-huh.
and it talks about this very thing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are very different circumstances involved. There's also, I mean, there's bias involved.
That's
Um,
part of the different circumstances.
yeah, and then there's also just the luck of the draw. I mean, like, you have interviews and you interview the less qualified candidate before the more qualified candidate. Less qualified candidate is qualified. So you don't bother with the more qualified candidate because you found your candidate. So I mean, there it's a luck of the draw. When you combine all of those things, and yeah, I mean, there are just 100,000 factors that go into determining whether someone is successful or someone is a failure, and we can't draw a conclusion. We can recognize the limitations of the problem of attributing success based on merit, but ultimately we have no idea of the of the reasons in any individual case. And we do know that God does not reward based on merit. We can't earn anything with God. But we like to think we can. I think we all like to think we can. So God's generosity is not merited. And here God's generosity is freely lavished on those most in need. So let's take a look at the landowner's response here, sort of as a pattern, starting in verse 13. So he addresses one of the grumbling workers as friend, which is, well, first of all, I guess the question is the landowner a stand-in for God? Or is he, as Herzog argues, an exploiter? What evidence do we have that he's a stand-in for God?
Well, he didn't pay according to merit. He was lavish to the one most in need.
Hmm.
He was present.
He was present, right? Right, he was present. That's really a salient feature. He was present. So we often see God as inert and inactive. So dressed as Kyrios in the parable in verse 8. Ordinarily, a landowner would be addressed as householder, not as Lord.
Mhm. In mine, it says on 11, and on receiving it, they grumbled at the householder.
Uh-huh. Right, it says householder,
Yeah.
but in verse 8,
The owner of the vineyard.
yeah, in verse 8, he's referred to the Lord.
Hmm?
And then in verse 15, and there the translation doesn't reflect it, he refers to himself as good. So remember was it in the last chapter? With the Jesus encounter with the rich man, Jesus says that
Call
only
yourself
God is
good.
good, right?
Yeah.
So here the landowner is referring to himself as good in the original Greek manuscript. So that solidifies um, the kind of image of the landowner as a stand-in for God. And then, of course, he himself is hiring the laborers. He's not delegating, and he in determining how much they're paid, the amount that they need to survive for the day. So let tomorrow worry about tomorrow, which is consistent with Jesus' message. So we have, so in some, we have really kind of a parable can be used to attack, on the one hand, prosperity theology, right? That God blesses us with material things, and to the extent that we have material things, we've been blessed by God. And the second
Unless it's the person that's worked all day, that wouldn't be prosperity, just the 11th hour one. They'd have to pick and choose the part of the verse they read.
Right. Well, picking and choosing is what it's all about. Yeah. Actually, when we get to the request of James and John's mother for James and John to sit at the right hand of Jesus, what I think we're going to do is do kind of a reading of what Jesus says, reading of what the disciples hear. So, evidently what they've cut out of the message, which I think, will be sort of useful and kind of interesting and sort of fun. But yeah, it's a real problem that we tend to proof text our favorite verses and cut out context and lose the broader meaning when we focus on the things we personally find most comforting, which usually, kind of things that work for us and often not for very many other people. And then the second thing that it sort of refutes is the stratified view of the notion that there are three heavens in heaven: one for the lower tier of people, the second for a middle tier, and the third for those who are great in the kingdom of heaven, which of course Jesus says is illusory.
But it's the least.
But it's the least. So let's look at the landowner's response, starting in verse 13. Right. So he starts with friend, which is a very cool, distant way of, almost ironic way of addressing him, since he's grumbled and complained very much like the Israelites complained in the wilderness. I mean, he's gotten what was promised to him, but because someone else gotten the same, he's upset. But that is of no concern to him. He got what he was promised. It's what also is under attack here is the notion of of a zero-sum society, right? So the that grumbling workers' belief is that if I get something, someone else should get less, right? And if someone else gets, they're taking away from me what I should get. But God isn't like that, and God does not support the zero-sum society. What I get does not take away from what God gives me, does not take away from what God gives others, because God possesses all things. God has no needs, and God is not limited by anything. It's our understanding that's limited of God, and it's not a zero-sum society. So, friend, obvious annoyance. I am doing you no wrong. So he's basically basing his observation on legal rights. The worker has not been wronged because he's being paid what was agreed, right? The denarius. Did you agree with me for a denarius? A rhetorical question. Take what belongs to you and go. So, an imperative. I choose to give to this last as I give to you. So, an observation based on reason. It's my choice, and I can pay as I please as long as I'm paying what agreed upon to you. So, a second rhetorical question: am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? And finally, or do you begrudge my generosity? So it's a third rhetorical question, but so an open-ended query that drags us into the parable. So the question is here, do we agree with supposedly wronged worker? And are we like the murmuring workers? Do we think that we deserve better? Do we think we've earned something better than others? Do we see ourselves as more diligent, more deserving, more whatever? And so the point in the parable is justice is served, but mercy added. Jerome points out that with regard to the workers of the 11th hour, everyone equally accuses the householder of injustice. Yet they do not understand their own treatment to be unjust. And yet it is not so much that you desire to receive more yourself, but that another should receive nothing, as though the merit of your reward is diminished by the participation of another. So that's a really sort of powerful statement that kind of puts it in perspective, that the grumbling is not that workers who have worked all day feel that they've been cheated by the one denarius, they've gotten. So they've been cheated by the fact that someone else has gotten a denarius, which has diminished their reward. And so they would be happy if that other person were not paid or were paid complete pittance that would be, 1/12 or whatever of what they received. So you define yourself in relationship to what others are receiving and feel um, hurt that they're getting more than they deserve. Which reminds me, the opposite to affirmative action is very much like that,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Focusing on what others are getting, which they presumably don't deserve, which minimizes what you have, and you wouldn't really be happy unless they have nothing. So it's really
Talked about in that book I was reading.
uh-huh. So I mean, it's really in many ways, it exposes um, sort of uncharitable, hateful, cruel attitude toward others and an elevation of self really through pomposity and hubris.
Mm-hmm.
So thoughts about that? Comments?
I think I've already made some.
What, Mary?
I said I've already made some having to do with that. So
Uh-huh. Any comments more generally on the parable?
oh. Well, it gives us food for thought. First of all, nothing's guaranteed. You must continually work for being a disciple.
Uh-huh. Look at
Not expect anything. Be grateful for what you
right.
get.
Everything that comes God comes through God's grace.
Uh-huh.
Even the gifts that we have that we think we
Our own doing.
are our own doing, and the basis for us to merit things are also themselves unearned gifts from God. They're the results of grace.
Uh-huh.
So that's one thing. Another is to look at compassion with those around you. So
But thinking today we're having some work done on our driveway, and I was watching the two young men working on it and thinking, my goodness. In fact, I asked them at one point, I said, aren't you just exhausted from all, because they had poured cement earlier in the day before coming to our house. And I said,
yeah,
aren't you just exhausted? And they said, well, yes, but this is what we do. And I just thought, wow, their job is so hard, but they were
right.
doing it. And
Uh-huh.
they were doing it well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think if I were doing, I had been out there cutting bushes and pruning and stuff to get ready for them, and I was grumbling. And I'm thinking, what I did was nothing compared to what they were doing. I was grumbling to myself.
Mhm. Right. Yeah.
But it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Often people who are, well paid and have, particularly, sort of whatever service jobs or, kind of what are they called? Like, thinking jobs
Right.
as opposed to manual labor. We tend to look down at, manual laborers. And yet their work is indispensable.
Mm-hmm.
Without it, the bread doesn't get baked. We don't eat. We can't do anything because nothing gets made.
One of the issues was that our stairs are not to code, our steps leading up to our house. And as our friends are getting older, they're stumbling on them. So we
Right,
have to get it fixed. And
right.
we don't have the skill to do it. So we're
Yeah.
depending on these men who do have the skills, and yet they're working
Mhm.
so hard.
Yeah, yeah, right. And people work very hard, and we often don't appreciate it. We look down on people who work, and we look down on people who are desperate, and we often look down on people who have nothing,
Mm-hmm.
sort of think it's their fault. And if they would just stop being lazy, they would be okay. But that is not an accurate view, and that's not how God sees it. And so, actually, in some ways, the danger here, I mean, when we have that attitude, the danger here is that we, in fact, can become last and be excluded. That's not really said in the parable, but, you know, it's always a possibility that when one becomes pumped up enough by one's own merits, one sees everything as a zero society in which others deserve less because I deserve more, then there's always a possibility that when you stand before God, God will say, "You're not worthy."
You already got yours.
Right. You have had your reward.
Yeah.
So, um, so this is a powerful parable that uh, I think for all of us points to an area in which we need God's grace to grow in compassion, to grow in uh, understanding, to grow in connection to the around us, and to grow and to get over ourselves. we all need to get over ourselves.